Sorry, thank you for waiting. I'm connected with my colleagues at reception. There's some people, there's always there's a bottleneck at reception, but I'll start and then they can join. In first place, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to London Business School. For those that are not from the school, welcome to all of the others, so the students, faculty, alums, friends of the LBS and the Will Institute. Welcome for those joining online as well. So we are streaming this live. We have almost 500 people registered online. So thank you for joining online too. My name is Tiago Martinho. I'm the Executive Director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development here at London Business School. At the Wheeler Institute, our mission is to improve lives through business. We are one of the research institutes of the school, and we look at applying rigorous insights and research and convene different perspectives to address some of the world's most pressing challenges, especially in emerging and developing countries. A core part of that mission is creating events like this one, is bringing people together around certain topics and inviting distinguished speakers to join us and to share their perspectives. So this evening is very much an example of what the Will Institute stands for. Artificial intelligence is reshaping industries globally, as all of you know, transforming how we work, and opening entirely new pathways to value creation. In Africa, where more than 20 million young adults will enter the labor force every year between now and 2050, the potential of AI on jobs, growth, and investment is immense. Today, we want to explore not only how AI might influence Africa's economic future, but how African economies, innovators, and investors can shape the future in a bold and inclusive way. So we are honored to welcome an exceptional panel of leaders whose experience spans technology, investment, and entrepreneurship across the continent. So tonight we have here Tokombo Ishmael, managing partner and co-founder of Alithea Capital. Thank you for coming. We have Henry Obi, partner at Helios Investment Partners, LBS alum, and member of the LBS governing body. Thank you. And we have Ido Sam, investor and former partner at TLCom Capital. We are also delighted to welcome Jake Kendall, general partner at DFS Lab, who will set the scene, guide us through the key themes and moderate the conversation of the panel, and then Q&A from the people in the room and from those joining online. So from those joining online, be free to submit your questions on the Zoom function, and then we will look at those questions and hopefully answer some of them in the Q&A. So the outline, the structure for the event is very straightforward. Jake will start to setting the scene. He will tell you about some context on employment and investment in Africa. So there will be a presentation for around 20 minutes. And then the panel will join. And Jake will moderate the conversation with the panelists for a while, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So pretty straightforward. And in total, the event should last around 75 minutes to 90 minutes. I would like to thank you, a very special thank you to DFS Lab in the person of Jake, and the LBS Data Science and AI Initiative, and many of our student clubs who also supported and promoted the event. The FS Lab and the LBS Data Science and AI Institute as co-organizers. Many thanks for the support and involvement. Thank you again for joining us, and please welcoming Jake on stage to start this presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Tiago. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to the London Business School for hosting this. It's been really exciting. Today has been, as all of you know, we've already been through kind of a closed-door roundtable, and now being able to come out and talk with a wider audience is great. We've had a wonderful conversation so far. I wanted to start with first kind of introducing myself, and I think we have some slides, but if not, I can just talk. So I'm, as Tiago said, general partner at DFS Lab. My background is an economist, trained, I see, there we go. trained as an economist, but then for the past 7 years been running DFS, which makes me an investor. DFS Lab is kind of an interesting take on an investment fund. We have two kind of branches of what we do, right? One is as an investor over on the right side of the slide there for you guys. And in that capacity, we've invested in almost 50 African startups who are creating a modern digital economy across the continent. But we also do research. And so we dig into data collection, research, and trying to understand the ecosystem within which we work from a more deeper kind of data-driven perspective. So, and here's our team kind of scattered across different parts of the world. We try to bring both a global perspective on best practice in technology and the different business models and approaches around the world, but also a very local, granular approach to how do you succeed on the continent. So we're past the introduction part. We can get to more interesting stuff. So I wanted to break this into kind of two parts, right? So starting with kind of a global perspective of what's happening in AI at the economic level, and then I'll go into a second part where we're looking more at the continent and what's happening in Africa. And of course, I think the first wave of impact from AI is potentially being felt a little bit sooner or faster in the U.S. or in Europe and some of the more economically advanced markets. But if nothing else, it's maybe there where we have more data so we can see what's happening better in any case. And as Thiago said, what I'm focusing on is the interaction between AI and employment and the job market. And I'll get to why I think that's so important in a second for the African continent. So I'm going to do a quick Econ 101 theory on AI and jobs, all right? Hopefully it helps kind of set the stage and give you a framework to think about all of this. So if you look at the slide here, we've got these four icons. On the left side of the slide, I think, is kind of the story that most people think about, which is you've got humans, and humans have jobs, and within those jobs, they do different tasks. And that's kind of the starting point. And then every once in a while, technology, in this case AI, comes along and automates those tasks, right? So takes over some of those tasks, and then in some cases actually takes over some of those jobs, right? So may actually displace people. And a lot of us think in terms of this kind of fight between the humans and the machines, right? Where humans have jobs, machines are taking them away. Sometimes they're improving the productivity of those jobs, but then sometimes they're also eliminating those jobs. The picture, I think, is more complicated and more nuanced, right? So when we think about AI, and most technologies kind of fall into this framework as well, one thing that AI can do can automate and take away a job, right? Make it irrelevant. Another thing it can do is augment a human, right? Give a person a more powerful set of capabilities and tools. As those three processes play out, another thing that happens that gets a little less attention is very, very important if you look at past waves of technological innovation, how they've impacted the labor market, is new and emergent roles and new and emergent tasks, right? So these are things that maybe didn't exist in the job market before, but as new technologies come along, they create new jobs. If you go back in time to the manufacturing revolution, creation of cars and mass adoption of cars created jobs like auto mechanic, right? Which obviously didn't exist in the 1800s or earlier. And now we're seeing new jobs like, prompt engineer for AI or AI content creator, things like that. So I just want to make sure that we're all thinking about the different, the more nuanced sort of picture about how AI can interact with the job market. I'm going to go through the theory a little bit more deeply real quick. This graph here is supposed to represent how those different, phenomenon can emerge in the labor market, right? So if you think about, if you line up all the tasks that get done in the entire job market. And this is a little bit abstract, as you know. This is the way we economists like to think about things, is complete abstraction, right? No connection to the real world. If you think about all the tasks, if you were able to sort of list them all out that people do, you could have everything from rolling a cart down the road to I don't know, having a meeting, having a sales call, writing an email, right? These are all different tasks. If we were to line them up from ones where machines have the lowest cost and therefore the best, the sort of the best at doing them, and then tasks where machines have a harder and harder time and therefore we model it as being higher cost, but it's maybe just they're harder for them to do, right? And then you can do the same with humans, right? So humans, to get a human to do the task might be costly. If you're over here off the end of this curve, it might be things like lift a car up so that someone can get underneath and change the oil, right? Humans really can't do that. You'd have to have a bunch of humans. But machines are actually quite good, right? And then you get over here and you get into things where only really a human can do it. Maybe there's art or certain care tasks and things like that. And then in the middle you have stuff where humans and machines are kind of in competition, right? They're pretty close. You could go one way or the other. So the idea is at this point here, the cost to doing things with a human on this side is more advantageous. And so we'll say that these tasks are being done by humans. And then over here, machines have an advantage. Their cost structure is lower, i.e. they're better at doing them. And so machines do those tasks. So that's just a starting point. And if you go back to our icons that we had earlier, you could think here, here's the sort of automated machine-based tasks. Here's the human. So those are those two, the first two kind of icons that we had. Now, what happens when you have an innovation that makes a whole bunch of different tasks more efficient from a machine's perspective? And that's what we might call a general purpose technology type innovation, one that affects a whole bunch of different tasks. And that's what most people think about for AI, right? If you think about it, AI is being used across lots of different kinds of tasks at this point. Now, that shifts down, makes it cheaper or more effective to use AI in a lot of different places. And what it does is it shifts a whole bunch of tasks that were over in this human region here, now become tasks that move into the machine region and become tasks the machines do. Now, two things happen within these tasks, right? One is some of those tasks are associated with jobs that just get sort of automated and relegated to history, right? So and we're seeing that, and I'll go into some of that data. There's a lot of jobs, there are some jobs that are kind of being wholesale pushed out into being completely automated by machines. Some of those tasks are in jobs where the person is going to stay there, but they're going to benefit from that automation, right? A lot of you may be using AI in your work, and it's hopefully making you faster, more efficient, more effective, whatever it is. And so this is not all job loss here. Some of it is augmentation, some of it is displacement or job loss. And then the next thing that happens is the whole frame window basically moves, right? Some tasks get retired and moved out of the job market, right? We don't have a lot of people who make cannonballs anymore, for example, or jobs that were more relevant in the long distant past. And now we have, as I said, we have sort of new tasks that kind of get added on here, and they might start out as human and eventually get automated, right? So that's quick introduction. Hopefully it helps to think about theoretically kind of what kinds of impacts we might see. Now, there is some data, right? So all that's theory, but we don't know how many people are being displaced, how many people are being augmented, how many new jobs are being created, all those kinds of questions, and which are the main channels through which it's actually operating in the economy. So I'm just going to run through a light touch. This is not supposed to be a comprehensive survey of all the data and research. Of course, tons of people are researching these questions with a lot of interest because it's such an important topic. But a couple of important studies that have found I think important results. These are in the United States, right? So we're not yet talking about Africa or any African country. So in this first study, these guys, Brinjasam, Chandar, and Chen, they have data from large employers, from probably the majority of large employers in the United States, right? So that's kind of your context for where this data applies. And they take, they have very kind of fine-grained data, and they can break it down by what's the age of the person being employed. So are they early career, developing, mid-career, or senior? And they can also look at sort of how exposed their jobs are to being automated by AI or to using AI to augment them. So to what extent is that job something that AI could do or contribute to? And what you see, this is software developers, and you see that software developers in the junior groups around 2022, which is when ChatGPT came out, everybody was kind of going up at about the same rate, and then all of a sudden the junior people start to take a big hit, right? Now, what they do find is that the general trend is up. So employment and sort of growth in the software development field is still roughly positive, but it's really not positive for the junior people, the least skilled. They then they also look at they take early career people and look at them across different roles, and the lines here, the darker they get is the more exposed, and the lighter they get is less exposed. So you can see that it's not the fact of being early career, because early career people in the least exposed roles, where AI just doesn't have a role, maybe it's Baker, maybe it's someone who does a physical task of some kind, et cetera, they're not at all being affected, whereas it's the folks who are exposed, right? So that's one observation. The other one is, this is more sectoral data. So just looking at sectors and how many people they employ across the United States again. And you're seeing a similar pattern in the sense that you're seeing less nuanced version of the same pattern. So you're seeing that since AI arrived, which is kind of in this early, right around at this point where you start to see this change in the trajectory, you're starting to see growth in wages and employment this is the growth in sectors that are most exposed to AI. And the way you want to reconcile these two things is that overall growth in AI-affected industries has actually gone up, and wages have gone up, and the overall effect has been positive, but it's not been positive for the youngest and least experienced workers. So that gives some cause for hope, but one thing that's important is that this is a really rapid change by sort of historical job market standards. So this is a really big displacement. And even if, broadly speaking, there are positive effects, that displacement can be really painful and really hard to manage and deal with. So that's just one set of data, one set of observations from the U.S. where maybe things are happening sooner, with adoption happening a little bit faster, right? There's then been a number of other studies where they look at, within a particular industry or industry context, or within a particular company in most cases, what if we give AI to one group of workers in an experiment and then compare them to a control group, right? So these are randomized control trials. And what you see are, in a broad set of very different contexts, all within kind of services and sort of knowledge work, but in very different types, you see pretty similar effects. So first effect is that across all of these call center agents, I think they're based in the Philippines, so they're sort of outsourced call center, generic office workers, software developers, and management consultants, so folks kind of all across the spectrum. You get relatively large increases in productivity, and then you also get increases, proportionally larger increases in productivity for the least skilled and lowest, earliest sort of workers, right? So you are seeing the folks who are kind of least skilled and least effective level up and catch up, not entirely, but get a lot closer to the people who are the most skilled and the most productive, right? So that, in some sense, is maybe a hopeful picture, in the sense that, you can imagine AI sort of being a pathway for junior, younger, less experienced people to sort of level up. And when we think about the impact in Africa, so now I'm starting to get to what this might mean across the continent in different African markets, if you think about it at that on a mass scale, African countries, as a rule anyway, have a lot of people who are often lower skilled, right? They haven't had the opportunities educationally or in the workforce to build their skills to the level of folks in other parts of the world. And so this, at some level, maybe gives some hope for that. Now, to be seen if that actually plays out in reality, right? The one thing to think about in this management consultant experiment, one thing they did find is when when they were asking AIs to do things that were sort of outside of their training data, they did not increase productivity. In fact, they might have actually decreased productivity by giving probably nonsensical answers and hallucinations. And that's a warning sign, I think, if you think about how little of the training data generally that goes into frontier models comes from the African continent or the African context. Maybe that's a little bit of a warning sign to say this broader pattern may not play out, right? So. Now, we talked a little bit about automation, removing people, displacing people from the labor market with technology, and augmentation, right? So these folks at the International Labor Organization, they keep this huge database of all the jobs in the world and all the tasks associated with those jobs. It's true. Now, that database is hopelessly impossible to keep completely up to date, as you can imagine. New jobs appear all the time. They can't have the whole world in their database, but they do a pretty good job. So, and they do as good a job as I think one could do. And so what they did is they went and looked at all those tasks across all those jobs, and they said, we can rate all these tasks. I won't go into sort of the complexities of how they do it, but you can rate the tasks in terms of how exposed they are to being done by AI. And then you look at jobs and say, this job has some tasks that are really hard for AI to do and some tasks that are easy for AI to do. That job is one where we're going to see augmentation because AI is going to be adapted to do the easy tasks that it does well, but it can't replace the human completely, right? So that's here. And then down here, these are jobs where almost every task is automatable. We're probably going to see a lot of displacement in those jobs. One thing you see, and they broke it down by different countries in the world. So lower income, middle income, higher income, right? So one thing you see is that the lower income countries are actually much less exposed, right? There's not that many jobs that can be automated out. A lot more jobs are physical in nature or require some sort of human component that just doesn't seem easy to replace. The other thing to see is that augmentation is much greater as a sort of opportunity or potential outcome than automation. So we would expect that a lot more jobs will be automated, and that's across all different types of countries. So just some data that gives context on where we're seeing, progress already, and what that looks like so far. Now I'm going to go into, a little bit deeper look at how this might play out on the African continent. And again, I don't think anyone can say they know the answer to this question yet. There's not that much data to this point, and also, it's a field that's moving so quickly and changing so fast. But we can make some observations maybe, and hopefully that will help inform our discussion later. So, first, to me, start with kind of thinking about what's the economic context in which this is happening, okay? And if you look at this first sort of panel here, this is charting out population growth over time broken into different age segments, right? So you've got folks that are old, past retirement age, folks that are young, pre-job market, and then this red line is folks who are going to be joining the job market. And this goes from 2015 all the way out to 2100, so really far into the future. And what's remarkable, I think, the thing that you should pay attention to on this is this growth in the number of people who are going to be joining the job market every year. If you kind of chart this out, in the next 40 or so years, African countries are going to have to incorporate about 500 million people into the job market as new people joining the job market with no previous experience, no skills, et cetera. And as I'm sure many of us know, the past history of incorporating new people into the job market in African countries is not great, at least in the broad picture of that. Now, for me, it's one of the, this is one of those things where when you start thinking about it, how big of a challenge and how important this is, for me, it's the only lens. I want to look at everything through this lens, right? So that's part of why I'm so interested in this question of AI and jobs, right? Not just AI in general. So let's put a little bit more nuance on that. This is employment by sector over time in Africa. And you can see here, blue is agriculture, slowly going down. Yellow is services, going up, mostly taking over from agriculture. And industry and manufacturing are basically stable with very little change. Now, if you looked at other parts of the world, let's say East Asia, with their sort of miraculous growth story, or Latin America, Eastern Europe, you would see a very different picture at the same, if you looked back at the period when they were at kind of a similar level of growth and development to where Africa and countries are now as a whole. You would mostly see almost an inversion of these two bottom lines. You would see a similar thing here, agriculture being replaced by sectoral transformation into other sectors, but people are being absorbed into the services sector right now in Africa, not into manufacturing. And the problem is services don't have a history of being the best jobs for growth, right? They are not amenable to productivity enhancements through capital investment and technology and those kind of things in general in the past. So when economists see this, they worry, right? That these jobs might be better than agriculture, but they might not go, as far as we need to go in terms of bringing, wealth and prosperity to the broad sort of population. Okay, so that's the economic context, or a few interesting points about the economic context. So then what's the context in which AI is evolving right now? One thing for me is this top graph is I think very, very important to think about, which is what this charts out is from when the internet was invented back in I want to say the 80s, or when it first started to reach some sort of mass, use by people outside of industry labs and things like that, to the point where 90% of the people using the internet were outside of the United States, right? So that's the metric that you're looking at. That was a 23-year period. This is about 1992 or something like that, early 90s. Took that long to go from something where the vast majority were in the U.S. and to one where it was pretty equal. There was a lot more people outside. This is that same graph for LLMs, right? 3 years, boom. So it's a very broad-based global adoption pattern, very different from the internet, which is a comparable sort of broad technology that's applicable across many different activities. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, is that this is not just concentrated in very wealthy countries or in the US. Now, these two graphs are closely related, and to me they're very important, which is this one here is how much is being spent to train individual models. And as you can see, this is logarithmic. So every notch on this graph is 100x change, right? Because you're going from, each one is 2 essentially. So that's huge, right? So you're talking in recent years 5x per year growth in the cost of training the frontier models, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down. We've all kind of heard this, but to see it on paper in logarithmic form is pretty kind of awe-inspiring. This is not a game that very many institutions or even countries can play anywhere in the world, right? That, would be it's very difficult to imagine any African country doing this, but even European countries, Latin American, whatever. I mean, everybody is struggling. China and the US are pretty much the only two players in that game. At the same time, and actually partly because of these huge investments in model training and infrastructure, you have this crash happening in the cost. And this is also a logarithmic scale. So this is, incredibly fast crash in the cost of doing inference. So using these models to make decisions or come up with jokes or create silly memes or whatever, whatever you use them for. People use them for all kinds of things, but you're having this massive crash. And when we see crashes in, the cost of doing something this rapid and this kind of jarring, you expect to see big effects, right? Because if you think about, when the internet came around and cloud computing and sort of some of those technologies that allowed us to create companies, create technologies, and scale them so much more quickly than previous generations have been, that obviously changed many, many things, right? Across lots of different sectors. The internet was huge. And you've probably all seen the cost curves of how much it took to start a tech startup. In the 90s, it was $500,000. Early 2000s, it was 50,000, and now you can do it for $500, right? So, and so that this should be revolutionary. We're waiting to see a little bit because it's happening so quickly. But I think for me, this means that this game is very hard to play. It's kind of a superstar effect game where only the very biggest, most well-financed players can play. But this game, everyone can play, right? Now, we talked a little bit about services a little bit ago, right? African economies, as a rule in general, it's not true in every single one, but as a rule, they're largely being, basing their current growth patterns on growth in the services sector. One of the problems, and I mentioned economists always get worried when they see that, is that most services are not exportable, and therefore you're limited by domestic demand for whatever the service is. And that means that your growth can only be so fast. Whereas if you think about most of the growth takeoffs that happened in other parts of the world, is usually driven by exports, right? We make cars, we make clothing, we make soccer balls, whatever it is, and we just ship them out to the world. And so we can grow as fast as we can, basically. As long as we can find new markets and keep selling them, we can grow, we can grow, we can grow. Services often don't have that. But one thing that AI, and these are all kind of based on a number of recent studies, AI is changing that to some extent. It's actually showing that you can change what is tradable, and AI helps you do that. Now that process already started with the internet and with outshoring, offshoring and outsourcing. So AI isn't sort of new to this, but it's potentially very powerful in sort of increasing what can be traded, what can be sold across border virtually, and that kind of thing. Partly through reducing language and translation, frictions, making localization a lot easier, faster, whether that's localization to contractual norms, standards, or cultural, localization, and then regulatory compliance as well. Like, if I have a food product or a car or something that has to fit into a regulatory regime, and you've got 180 different ones across the world, that can also be so. AI is changing what can be traded, which I think is very interesting, and it's doing so often in what we call modern services. So these are services that are traditionally done more kind of think white collar, so finance and technology, IT, outsourcing, things like that. This shows some data on those modern services as traded services, right? So blue is modern services. The dark blue line is the blue dotted line is sort of wealthy economies, and this is the share of modern services in what they trade. So basically, it's gaining ground on manufacturing and other kinds of things that we traditionally think of as traded, as traded. It's going even faster in developing countries. So developing countries' modern outsourcing of services that they're trading is going even faster. So I personally find that maybe hopeful in the sense that that's potentially a very important economic pathway for growth, right, in a services-based model. Now, just to wrap things up, this comes from a paper written by my co-author. This is a paper that kind of shares some of this stuff in a more detailed form, if you're interested. He did this paper where they look at companies or countries that make investments in different kinds of AI, so breaking down specific types of AI. And they have a broad view on what that is, so robotic automation, lots of different elements. And then trying to see, if you invest in that technology, where do you see growth in your exports in the future, right? So in robotic automation, you see things like ships, electronics, maintenance, textile, all those things where robotic automation could apply and then help grow the sector and improve its efficiency so that it competes internationally better, right? So to me, what this says is if you want to think about services-based growth or any kind of growth, you don't want to just sort of invest generally in technology or in AI, but you want to target it at the types of technologies that are going to boost the sectors that you're trying to export. And so really having a more nuanced, targeted approach and not just saying, oh, we're going to invest in training 100,000 AI engineers or investing in hardware and infrastructure generally, but we don't know what people are going to use it for. But really thinking through very concrete, specific use cases oriented around specific sectors where you think your economy is strong. I think there's a lot to that. And if you look back at other, like I said, sort of industrial policy that's been successful in other parts of the world, that's often a very clear characteristic, is that they don't just sort of invest broadly in industrial policy. They invest in specific sectors where they think they can compete, right, and grow and drive jobs. So, here's a few things that I take away. One, to focus on exports within the services sector might be a good area for African economies. To be targeted, like I said, have a specific vision of what you're trying to achieve, not just general purpose. Focus on augmentation, technologies that augment labor, not replace people. You're going backwards if you do that. I don't think we want to get sucked into the hardware race, which we hear a lot about, of like, do we have enough GPUs to blah, blah, blah. If you're, as I said, if you're using models that already exist and using and applying them to important local problems, you don't need that kind of hardware, right? Export discipline is a concept that was, I don't know who developed it first, but certainly used in Japan, China, a number of the Asian countries, to say, if we're going to support a sector, whether it's AI or anything else, we want to see that it leads to exports. And so companies used to have to bring their export receipts in order to continue to maintain their status within government support programs. And that kind of discipline is really important, right? Because so many government support programs to sort of grow a specific sector just end up making a few people rich in that sector and actually not growing the sector, right? And then I think better data to target these things. If you're going to advocate for targeting and the kind of nuance that some of this requires, you need to have better data. And so creating a data set for across the continent that really fits the African context, but also this sort of broader theory would be important. So those are just some observations, current data, recent research, hopefully interesting and hopefully kind of inspires thinking and gets your mind moving. Now we're going to talk to the real experts who are going to bring the real knowledge. Yeah, I think we'll have a good conversation. Do you guys want to come up and join? I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves, since I've already introduced myself, and I think Tiago actually did introduce you, but maybe kind of restate for the audience here and online who you are, but maybe your connection to Africa and the I space and sort of the broader topic, through some specifics. Ido, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Ido, and I've been working in the crossroad of Africa and technology for the last almost 20 years, since 2006. Before that, a little bit in technology back home, but spent a few years as a founder in East Africa, and then another 14 and something years in venture in Africa, helping to put together one of the first venture funds in Africa called TLCom Capital, which I've recently parted ways with, and I'm currently thinking through a few new ideas that I want to explore in the next couple of months.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tokumbo Ishmael. I'm managing partner at Alethea Capital, a company that I co-founded nearly 20 years ago. I've been investing on the African continent now for nearly 25 years. And when we started Alethea Capital, it was really about how do we finance businesses in Africa that are mission-driven, that can enable us not just to make returns, but also enable financial inclusion, energy inclusion, and most recently, gender inclusion. So really driving for development impact so that ordinary folk can reach their potential. Most recently, well, from the very beginning, we were investing in tech-enabled businesses, and most recently, we started shifting to looking at new technologies that can really help us drive on the impact outcomes that we're looking for. And so technology from a digital transformation perspective, which includes AI, and also energy transition from green technologies, also in terms of driving for business resilience and resilience in the African economies.
My name's Henry Obi. I'm a partner of Helios Investment Partners. Helios was started in 2005, 2006, and now we manage over $3 billion of capital, and we have a public listed vehicle in Canada. And the sectors we invest in are financial service and tech and fintech, tech-enabled businesses, digital infrastructure, and non-discretionary consumer goods. And then we have a climate fund, and then we have a sports and entertainment fund. I don't know if any of you have been to Afro Nations, but yeah, we're one of the backers of Afro Nations. So yeah, that's me.
Great. So I thought what we could start with is maybe share with the audience some of the most exciting things that we talked about in the previous roundtable. So, and for each of you individually, what did you think was most interesting or most exciting? And can be what you said or can be what someone else said. Thinking in particular about where are the opportunities for AI to drive competitiveness, jobs, and growth, right? That's the big picture. We're going to get into investment in a second. For me, it's interesting because I did not show this slide, deck to the participants, but this concept that I showed on one of the slides, where the cost of training and creating new models is rapidly getting out of reach of even, like I said, European governments, let alone African governments or corporations. But the cost of accessing those models is crashing, and that came out in the discussion clearly. And I think, to me, that's a really important point of departure for thinking about where are private sector, public sector entities across the continent, where should they be putting their focus and energy? I hear in policy circles, and just sort of generally, a lot of talk of, how do we get the hardware so we can build models and compete? And there is some context where that's an important question to ask, especially if you want to train models, that can't send data, for example, outside the country, right? If you have certain data that's too sensitive or important from a national, sort of security perspective or what have you, there are reasons to do that. But the way it's often been talked about is just sort of broadly, generally, we need, more hardware to sort of build more models. And I think, pushing back on that narrative and saying, actually, the best thing you can do is take the existing models, which are, so advanced at this point, and figure out how can you apply them to really important local problems and local opportunities. So that was, for me, a kind of a key point where I see a lot of opportunity. But maybe you differ if you want to.
I can go first. I mean, for us, there's significant investment opportunity in this area in many sectors, but I'll bring it home to where we've focused. And where we're focusing is really about business resilience in our companies and creating export giants. And in particular, we look at the energy sector, agriculture, manufacturing, and across those sectors, where we're seeing digital transformation and automation play a role, we're seeing operational efficiency. So that's a big area for us. How can you build resilience in businesses. And, we're talking about AI here, but we really have to start from tech enabling the real economy. If the real economy is not tech enabled, they can't participate in this so-called AI boom. So that's an area for us to build that kind of resilience. And going hand in hand with that is how do we enable energy access and transition in those businesses? With many African businesses, the highest cost bucket is energy. So when we are going into manufacturing concerns and enabling that energy transition, immediately we're dropping their costs by 50%, which is part of the resilience that we're looking to build. So I think if you can put the digital infrastructure and the energy transition in place, you can help build resilience. Another area is around education, because not just because you want to create an educated force that can export these skills, but really, how do you use the technology to facilitate better education so that we can have the educated force, but we can have a more skilled force, even for the local champions that we're building. And the last one I'll mention, because there are many areas, but thinking about how Africa can not just be a consumer of all this great technology, but also a producer. So that's related to the education side and maybe also related to the hardware side of it. And we can talk about that later. But those are the areas where we're focusing.
Yeah, and just to add, we also talked about innovation, and I think innovation is key, especially in financial services, where a lot of people in Africa don't have bank accounts, and we can do more to ease the cost of flow of capital, of payments going back and forth across Africa. The other is health and health services. I think with this AI, there's a chap I was talking to yesterday, and he's a Nigerian and has developed a platform to enable early screening of cancer. And he's working with Mayo Clinic to develop this. And so can you imagine the amount of medical breakthroughs we could have with AI assisting us? And that's going to help a lot within the health space. And I noticed services, export services was one of the things you talked about, and I think it's really important, at least for investors, for us, it's all about dollar revenue. And export-driven services are really important. But then one of the graphs you mentioned was agriculture is declining. And what worried me in that sense was if agriculture is declining, then that means food inflation goes up. And so how do you balance that? And then the other thing is really long-term vision. We need people to put together a development policy that incorporates AI into the educational policies of most of the things that are going on.
So trying to maybe tackle it from a slightly different point of view, I think in some of your graphs you were showing that, what is moving is technologies is able to do more and more things that human used to be able to do, and there is augmentation, and then of course new jobs are created on the, I think it was the far right of the graph. But what to me is interesting, we are very, very focused on what is technology taking away vis-a-vis what it doesn't, and I think there is, with all this very big AI wave, there are things that will still require people. And what Africa has quite a lot of is people. Mm-hmm. And I think there are various ways to look at it, but one of them is how do you identify early which are these areas that will be stable, so not the ones that are closest to the middle and will be taken by technology in 3 days, but those that will require people longer term and train for that, and use technology for better training and try and place either people physically where the resources are needed are scarce, i.e. Europe, parts of Asia and so on, or otherwise, again, when we think about things that would need to be produced physically, and you've touched on the fact that services are harder to export than other things that the world will need into this revolution, right? So there are physical things from natural resources that will need to be processed to many other aspects, of power and so on and so forth, that need to be built, served, and sold. I think that, again, in those areas, if we can, there's a lower cost of labor, there is a mass layer of young people that are looking for opportunities, that young people in other parts of the world are less caring about at this point in time for an array of reasons. I think there is a very big opportunity to identify this earlier, do the training using a lot of AI and technology, potentially remotely, but then either selling to the outside world or even moving people to where this will be needed.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one because when you look at the difference between wages that the exact same person can make in an African market versus, European country, wealthier East Asian country, the U.S., it's huge, right? It's a huge differential. And we think about, trade cost differentials, goods cost a certain amount here, and then they're more here because of trade barriers. Those kinds of differences tend to be 10%, 20 maybe. You see return to capital differences based on frictions at borders between, American capital markets and European ones or African ones. The labor market frictions are massive, right? So, I think your point is very interesting. I'm curious, and Henry, you brought up the topic of how do we get Forex, right? How do we sell? Do you have a view on this particular idea that it's going to be more about shipping, finding ways for people to go to other parts of the world versus creating services where they can sell those services remotely to another? Do you have a view on where that goes, or is it all the above?
I think it's two-pronged. I mean, I look at the India example. Nehru created the Indian Institute of Technologies in 1945 or 47. And ever since, you've got a proliferation of Indian engineers all around the world. And so India exports engineers and other disciplines around the world. And one of the things that you find when the Indian government is negotiating a trade agreement with the UK is enlarging the number of visas that they want in the UK so that they get employment. And so the people that they export then send back the dollar revenues to the country to enable. And not only that, the Indian execs at the helm then create centers of excellence in India where they train more people. Then it's a rotating, cycle, so to speak, where then they go abroad and then make more money. And so I think that's one aspect. But the other aspect is almost like the call center principle, where you got cheap cost of labor, you got lots of labor, and all we need to do is train this labor in order to export that product and services. So there's a company in Africa at the moment. They've done the same thing. They've trained a large pool of engineers in Rwanda. And what they do is then go and look for consultancy agreements to build AI-generating products in corporates in the Western world, and they've been pretty successful at the moment. And so that's the kind of business model I foresee, where it's a win-win in terms of enhancing dollar revenue and upskilling the African continent, especially young people. And I think it's all we need is leaders with vision to implement it and people to implement an industrial policy. As you will know, the UK didn't have an industrial policy for the last God knows how many years until quite recently, and it's because people say you can't pick the sectors, but the US picks its sectors, and so Africa should learn a bit from the US.
Yeah. One of you were talking about sort of the call center model and the outsourced, as a complement, right? Not a substitute for the actual sort of immigration for labor. And one of the things I've been tracking is in India, where they're huge, kind of that sector is very, very developed, as you said. There's been 3 or 4 recent mergers or acquisitions between AI companies and outsourced companies. And in each of the cases, the picture you get is, we think that outsourced services are going to become sort of this blend where as the purchaser of those services, you don't really know, or maybe you're kind of switching seamlessly back and forth between people who are helping you, machines, AI bots that are helping you, and both at the same time. And so clearly there anyway, there's a vision that this isn't just, we're competing against the machines, but we're going to absorb them and build them into our model. But humans are still a very big part of it. So I'm hoping to see something like that, in Africa soon, because I think it's a very important sort of aspect in terms of how do you make this stuff even more sort of powerful and effective.
If I may, I think it's great that we have a youth dividend, as we say, a people dividend, and at the nexus of what you're saying with, business process outsourcing, there's a great opportunity. I would hope that all our people are not just reduced to being call center and BPO, and that we are thinking about how we skill people for the real sectors and also the industrial sectors, for manufacturing, for repeat education, for multi-sectors, across Africa. Africa's not a country, but across Africa, we can't just be reduced to outsourcing call center people. We want people that have critical thinking abilities. Educational policy should include technical and technology in the curriculum, but we need people who can think critically, and we can leverage AI to enhance that education. But I really hope that we are also developing a continent of people that can add value to products, that can think about how we use our resources more productively and for the continent, and not just be on the other end of a phone.
Absolutely.
So I agree with you, but I think the call center wasn't the right name to call it, because these are skill set engineers doing consultancy work abroad.
I hear you. I hear you. I just wanted to make sure that the audience didn't think we were reducing everybody to actually possibly having their jobs eliminated because they're just on the other end of a phone.
No.
Yeah. We're actually looking at a company right now, I won't say their name, in Nigeria, who are training people using AI to be chip engineers, and they're incredibly effective. Actually, it's pretty great to see as an export model. That's an amazing one, because that's clearly at the heart of what's happening right now in the AI race. So I guess building on what you said, Tukumbo, maybe we've been talking mostly in positive terms, but I do want to get into the negative stuff. I would feel guilty not doing it. One of the things I said in the meeting we had before was part of the reason I'm, want to have these kinds of meetings and I'm so fascinated with AI is that you can either think of it as the worst thing in the world, that it's going to destroy humanity, or this amazingly powerful force, or maybe both, which is how I feel about it. But it's incredibly important to talk about it one way or the other. So I want to hear from you guys on what are the things you really worry about in all this, especially obviously in relation to Africa, because there's many sort of general worries, but.
So I think you touched a little bit on, claiming that the cost of tokens is going down and so on and so forth, and that is making everything more affordable. And I think it's making it more affordable for the people in this room, but the gap still remains. In other words, the cost of data in Africa in absolute and relative terms is still 2-3 times higher than anywhere else. And if you now need more data rather than less data for a lot of these applications, and you need ongoing good connectivity and so on and so forth, there is a fairly reasonable risk or big risk that despite the fact that it's becoming cheaper for us, it's not becoming cheaper for the average person in Africa. And unless some of it will be subsidized or taken care of or thought of, sort of at a national level in some of the places, it's going to be very hard to expect that everyone would use ChatGPT or whichever, Claude, and so on and so forth on their phone starting tomorrow, even though it's accessible and dropped from $20 a month to 18, it is still very, very expensive in absolute terms. Yeah. So that to me remains a risk. And I think when we use cheaper, it's cheaper in relation to what is something we need to remember.
Yeah.
Good point.
For me, it's and I mentioned this earlier, there's an over focus on efficiency, and that over focus on efficiency does actually, many cases, result in reduced job creation. And we talk about our youth dividend. Once we've educated them, we actually do want them to be engaged and working and not just left behind. So for me, I want us to think more about resilience. Resilience. How do we use AI, like you said, in an augmented fashion and not just automated, that automates away the jobs. The other area is related to what I said earlier about how do African nations ensure that we are at the table and part of the architects and producers and not just consumers of these new technologies. How do we make sure that we have a role to play in the source of knowledge that goes into the LLMs and not just import knowledge from the West, because that's where people have been able to be skills to create these frontier LLMs. We need to have the specific LLMs for us. We should be leveraging our multi-language capabilities to think about that specificity. And the last thing I'll say around concerns is that there's AI hype, and that's causing some governments to just say, oh, AI. But where's the foundation on the digital infrastructure? Not just for the accelerators and the new economy folk, but really for the mom and pop SMEs. In Nigeria alone, we have over 20 million of those. Just multiply that across the continent. How do we make sure that they are not left behind because they are digitally excluded, they don't have the digital literacy, and they don't have the power to power the instruments of connection?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Tokes has touched on it. What if it doesn't go the way we all plan? Then the job losses instead of the job gains. So resilience is really key. And then just one of the two other things would be really just the unethical use of AI. And that we're seeing a lot of proliferation of that, and really regulation from that point of view, because it could cause a lot of social upheaval as well. And then just finally, in general, I just don't think that we have the infrastructure at the moment. Electricity is being one. The cost of electricity is 40%, of the total revenue cost. So I think we really need to look at ways of improving our infrastructure, first of all. Data centers, there's not a lot coming up. We've built one in Kenya, we've built another in Morocco, and we're looking at something else in North Africa. So it really is building up that data centers, and not building up data centers for hyperscalers. It is building up data centers for local use. A lot of countries are now mandating cross-border data policies where data has to be retained in country, especially health data. And we just don't want to see ways where that policy is being broken in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, I mean, your point on unethical use, I think, is a big one for me. I was reading about a cyber attack recently that was carried out almost entirely by AI, and they think a very small number of people were able to carry out a very extensive cyber attack where they could just automate and use AI to hack into different systems, and got pretty far. It's pretty scary. And I think on the continent that's even potentially higher risk. A lot of the legacy banks and things like that, their cyber systems are not always, what they should be. True of banks everywhere, actually. And then you think about also kind of manipulation and, pushing sort of people to the extreme as well, where AI is already being used for, social media to drive radicalization and things like that. And that becomes even more scary when you think about how many people are going to be trying to find jobs, and if that doesn't go fast enough, I mean, that's a really, you can imagine very bad scenarios. So for me, yeah.
Yeah, and we've already seen, look at Nepal, what's happened in Nepal or Bangladesh or Kenya, so
Tanzania.
what if it was AI-generated fake news that caused those upheavals, then that could be something else.
Yeah. So I think we're going to, on that bright note, we're going to turn to questions from the audience, and we're going to have some from the online audience, but then also some from the folks in the room, and we're going to take the mics to hand them out to people. So who has a question?
First of all, thank you guys so much for a really insightful conversation. I know we all really appreciate you coming here and lending your expertise. I have a question which actually came up in an LBS debate a couple of weeks ago around AI and the global inequality gaps that exist. You guys have mentioned a few features like the gap in terms of the cost of using data as in cell service in Africa relative to the global north. Also gaps in terms of the data available to AI models that is Africa-centric and in the African context. So given that we receive AI at this point and it's likely to, this is the starting point. There is a gap between who can deploy it the fastest. And it's likely to be one of the key drivers of accelerated growth in the next few years. Do you see this as maybe potentially widening that inequality gap as the global north countries accelerate more quickly from a higher starting point? Or maybe that it's other features that you've mentioned before might close the gap? I'd like to hear your guys' takes. Thank you.
I mean, I'll give a quick first pass on it, which is that I don't think either outcome is predetermined. So, I mean, I think that, good policy action, good action by the private sector and investors, entrepreneurs, civil society, those things make a difference, and they can turn the path one way or the other. And I think that if you just sort of throw up your hands and say, well, there's technology and it's going to happen and it comes from somewhere else, whatever, then yeah, probably you're as likely as not to get the worst or not a good outcome. But I definitely think these curves can be pushed. And so I think that's a very important, I think your question is very important, because it's one of the most important ones here, is how do we make sure that, that the benefits are broadly experienced. Maybe I'll pass to my colleagues to tell you how that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I mean, there will be a widening gap. I mentioned earlier that we don't even have digital infrastructure that enables people to be connected, right? We have some, and we've, obviously everyone will point to, oh, everyone's got a mobile phone. Well, all mobile phones are not equal. And so how people are able to access this technology will also be reliant on them having the proper mode of access, and us just having the digital infrastructure and the power. And also, talking about the ethical and responsible use of AI, because people might be connected, it's going to be very easy to export raw data, and then somebody else is processing that data to sell back solutions to us on the continent. Again, that's a source of widening. So I do think there will be widening gaps, and we do need to be intentional. Our governments and regulators do need to wake up and not just have vanity announcements, but actually get to the grassroots of what we need in terms of infrastructure and policy. I don't know.
Good question. Thanks. Who wants to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. So my name is Kevin. I'm an MBA student as well in the recently joined 2027 class. So I think there's been a lot of talk about the role of AI in services specifically. I was hoping to hear a bit more about what its role in agriculture could be, just given that, smallholder farmers comprise roughly around 50% plus of our workforce across the continent, right? And I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities there in terms of knowledge extension, which has been relatively inefficient to date, lending, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I'm quite curious about is a bunch of you guys have been investing on the continent, and I would imagine there are some founders who have been thinking about, sort of how to introduce these mechanisms and so on. So what challenges might they have come across? What new opportunities, might there be for people like us who are potentially thinking of being founders, et cetera, within that space?
Do you want to?
Sure.
So to your point, it is one of the largest still, despite the decline of employment in the continent, and yet it remains one of the more inefficient sectors globally. If you look at productivity of the average small plot farm in Africa, it is a fraction of an equivalent in most other places. And it actually decreases in time rather than increasing in time because they become smaller and smaller plots with every generation. So think that every family then have a few, children and keep dividing and keep dividing. What we saw in that, and we saw quite a few tries and backed a couple at the time at TLCom, or tried to back a couple of plays that were targeting that, is that at the end of the day, it is very complex to do a couple of things, but more than anything, it's to synchronize to try and really understand in real time, who does what and where, and how do you pick it up, centralize, and on sell, because eventually these things have an advantage to scale. So small plot farms are by definition inefficient. While they create a lot of employment, the only way to make them more financially productive is to try and aggregate output, better predict, the takeoffs and so on and so forth. And there is definitely role and room for AI in that. What we are also seeing is the ability to then create insurance products for small plot farmers using AI capabilities, so analyzing real-time data, weather data, drought data, and so on and so forth, and be able to allow insurance for these small plot farmers is helping a lot with increasing productivity over time. But to me, the solution is, one is tools like better insurance, better ability to, we've seen a lot of products ask in real time, what to do, what to plant, how to manage, and so on. These have been around. They did not change dramatically the situation. They may become cheaper or easier to use, but it's more how, in my view, you increase the efficiency of this as a sector rather than farm by farm basis, as that is still very challenging.
I can give a couple of case studies where we've invested in agro-processors that are building factories close to the farms, and then taking those farmers under their wing, and the manufacturers are using the technology to help the farmers improve their yield, to better plan, and have a better volume and better quality grade for offtake and immediate processing. So through the manufacturing plants, we're seeing that dissemination and use of technology, and not just technology, even energy access, because those plants are able to light up the communities and provide better conditions for the farmers to be able to provide a better yield. So we need to see more manufacturing concerns close to where the farmers are, rather than having the farmers have to just predict and think about how they can get to the cities where the buyers are.
Yeah, I think similarly, we just, it's been signed, but not yet closed, but it's public knowledge, that we've invested in a company called Raya. It's a strawberry producer in Egypt. And until we did the deal, I had no idea that Egypt was one of the largest exporters of strawberries in the world. Them and China. So, but we've part of the plan is to really to enhance the business of a new product that will be used a lot of technology, and then, as Tuk said, enable the farmers of improvement with scientific methodologies for yields, better yield of their crops.
Yeah, you hit on a topic that that lights up the boards whenever you talk to people in our space, because I mean, personally, I'll go even further, I think, than some of my colleagues here. I think there's been a huge amount of money wasted on startups trying to do something for smallholder farmers. And I can't even think of one that's successful. I don't know if you guys, that's truly made it to export velocity. And And that's not to say that you shouldn't focus on them, but equity-backed startups in this space have just a horrible, horrible track record. Now, what Tokunbo was talking about with going up the value chain to focus on the production, the packaging, the export value chain, that's very interesting and very important, because that's an area where you can apply technology, capital investment, and you can operate at a lot greater scale. And I gather with your strawberry investment, you're doing that whole chain probably, at once. But there's been so much focus on, can we give this product to a smallholder farmer and inform them or whatever? And I don't think AI changes that game at all, because I think personally, what you should be trying to do is get people out of get them out of that role. And if you're selling a product, you shouldn't be selling a product where what you really should be doing is helping that person stop doing what they're doing, right? You should be selling a product where you want to keep them what they're doing and have them do it better. I think we should, as a general rule, agriculture at that sort of smallholder farmer level is mostly a government job, right? It's not something the private sector necessarily can solve. If you look at, there are historically a few examples. Japan, China, Taiwan, France, where I live, all have engineered big boosts in smallholder farmer productivity, right? Which, could be potentially replicated in Africa, but mostly it was almost entirely driven by government investments in infrastructure to go to market, in seed distribution, fertilizer distribution, input distribution, education, a whole range of things, as well as market support. And if you look at, Japan and France, where I live now, France is where I live, you have tons of smallholder farmers, but they're in these incredibly high margin categories. So I have a house outside of Paris, and one of my neighbors has like one of the most prized like goat milk ice cream, sells to all the 1-star Michelin restaurants in Paris. That's very hard to replicate, around Nairobi or Lagos, right? So you have to think also about the market structure. So it's a very, very complex problem, and I think that AI doesn't necessarily change the game on that part of it very much. So I think we have an online question. Is that right?
Yeah, we've had lots of people joining online, and Victor has asked, where do you see the biggest skills gaps today, and what rapid interventions could realistically prepare millions of young Africans for AI-augmented jobs?
I don't think we didn't catch you. Can you repeat louder?
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Better, yeah.
Victor has asked, where do you see the biggest skills gaps today, and what rapid interventions could realistically prepare millions of young Africans for AI-augmented jobs?
Rapid interventions, guys.
Anything rapid? My first thing is anything rapid. We do need an educated workforce. Most of the young people that we talk about are not connected, so we do need them to have education to a certain level. We do need the digital literacy. So I would ask governments to please put in the infrastructure, please improve the educational infrastructure for the young people to be engaged. And then we need more on-the-job training within these entities. And there's some investment. I think you're in Andela, right? So there's training there as well.
Well, I think Andela is a okay example, though they pulled out of parts of Africa. But another investment that we've been involved in is i.e. Telecom, where I'm not anymore, but is the fastest growing digital university in Africa at this point in time, which started under 2 years ago and is crossing 20,000 students as we speak. Everything is online, very AI enhanced. All the case studies are done with AI and so on and so forth. So I think that the product there is not trying again to be the best at everything, is a lesser product for much less money. You get a good education for $150 a year. So it's not trying to compete with London Business School by no means, but it is trying to give mass education that is better than what's out there, is much more up to date, can be revised very, very quickly, and can be accessed by mass market at the right price point. So these are things that, to me, AI and technology play a large role. Still doesn't solve for accessibility, which we have touched on, which must be solved in parallel. But for those with some access, that reduces the price point by quite a lot.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we've seen are models that really focus specifically on a very specific trade or profession or niche, and can build sort of an AI-based learning model around that. You were asking for rapid, interventions. I think if you try to do the whole education system all at once, you're not going to do it. Not that that's not important, right? Very, very important, but it's not going to be rapid. But the rapid stuff you're going to see are very specific niche, like this particular profession or yeah. Go ahead. Another question?
Yeah, that's what I meant by on-the-job training.
Exactly.
Hi, thank you so much for a very rich conversation. The question I wanted to ask, which I was expecting that would be addressed, is around the ecological cost of the cloud, of AI. And if you're trying to build infrastructure, especially on the continent with energy deficit, how are you going to account for the cost of AI ecologically? Because the cloud is not just the cloud, it's actually on the earth. So how do we think about that, especially in relation to critical minerals and the conflict around that? So it would be really interesting to address that and how you marry that with investment and thinking about capital versus purpose. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, actually. And I'd mentioned this in the earlier session, that actually maybe Africa needs to think about a new model, a right-sized model for our AI infrastructure. And if I use an analogy to describe what I'm talking about, when GE was selling, whether it's printer scanners or medical scanners on the continent, obviously large scale, large size, not everybody could afford that. But low scale innovation that enabled the production of small handheld scanners, and in some cases, small, instead of large incubators, small sort of blanket type warming for babies, low scale innovation, you're able to think about the problem proximate to the problem and come up with the right sized innovation. And I think for Africa, again, and across all the African countries, we need to think about the low scale innovation that enables us to right size our AI infrastructure so that we're not using up the water and the resources in the way that we're seeing happen in the global north. So we really need to think about how we use the resources that we have, the critical minerals, in a way that we can actually innovate and send out to the world. In the earlier section, someone said that we're not going to have the next NVIDIA or the next frontier LLM. Maybe not those particular companies, but we're going to have the right innovation for us, right-sized and proximate to solve the problems that we have and we see daily. Low-cost innovation that will enable us to leapfrog on those problems, I think.
I think that's a great point, and I'm getting the signal that that should be our last point. Apologize to those of you who didn't get to ask your questions. We're going to hang around a little bit after, so if you want to come down, happy to chat. Thank you all for coming out. It's great to see such a great audience and really thoughtful questions. And thanks for welcoming us to London Business School. It's been a great experience. Thank you all, and hope to see you next time if we do another one of these.